Hi, folks. Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining us for our weekly chat about local history. Again, thanks for supporting this project. This week's topic comes from, as I was reading the East Aurora Advertiser last week, and I came across they published the Past in Pictures, and they always put a vintage photograph either from their own archives or something that someone has submitted. I don't generally submit. Some people think that I'm in charge of those past and pictures. No, the folks at the Advertiser do a great job with that. But last week's past and pictures piqued my interest, caught my eye, because it's something that has been brought up from time to time, and that is how women were referred in the newspaper or in society. And the picture is from 1974, and it's showing uh, a group of women from the East Aurora Country Club, and they're preparing for an East Aurora celebration, the Centelebration, an event that was going to coincide with the Village of East Aurora's 100th anniversary, the Centelebration then. But what caught my eye is they listed all the names of the women in the picture. Mrs. John Sansone, Mrs. Dean Gavin, Chairman Mrs. Randall S. Hawes, and then they made a note, which I found very, very interesting at the end. The current editors made a note at the end of this caption in the Past in Pictures that says the newspaper, the Easter Advertiser, does not have a record of the first names of the women in this photo because it was customary 50 years ago to be addressed by the husband's name after marriage. So you would be Mrs. Jack Williams, or Mrs. John Smith rather than your own name. Surprisingly, some people will be surprised to know that this tradition, this custom, continued into the 1970s, even into the 1980s and beyond. That women, once they became married, were addressed as Mrs. and their husband's name. Not only, and I talked to some young people today, and they just can't believe it because they've never lived in a time where that custom was happening. Is that even if a woman was referred to in the singular, so like oftentimes on a wedding invitation you'll see, or even in the newspaper, Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. But even if Mr. Smith wasn't doing anything, had nothing to do with what was being talked about in the newspaper, in the society column, the country club, they would still refer to Mrs. Smith as Mrs. John Smith, not her own first name. There's an old picture of me, not to brag, but I won a beautiful baby contest back in the 1970s, and my mother had clipped out the little clipping in the Easter Advertiser, and it was the local JC's chapter had sponsored this beautiful baby contest, and that's not the point of the story. But the picture in the paper was my mother holding me as a baby, and the chairwoman of the JC Jane C's, actually it was the woman's auxiliary of the JCs. Um, the, that the chairman woman of that committee was presenting the check to the winner, to my mother and me, and they referred to both my mother and the chairwoman of the committee as Mrs. and their husband's names, their husband's first and last name. And as I saw that, and I thought, this is the mid to late 1970s, and they're still doing that. That was still something that was being done in the newspaper. And as I saw that picture in the scrapbooks, in the family scrapbooks, it kind of dawned on me, well, in my lifetime, women were still being referred to by their husbands' first and last names. Well, as many of you know, I worked in many newspapers before moving on to being a historian. And we received a press release once when I was working at the Easter Advertiser from a local organization, and the press release had a photograph with it, and it had a caption, and it just like the picture from 1974. Um, it listed all the women's names by their husband's name. It would have Mrs. Howard Smith or Mrs. Joseph Smith, whatever. And I I couldn't believe it. And it was like 2003, 3, 2004. 20 years ago is when I worked as was the editor of the East Aurora Advertiser. So just 20 years ago, there was an organization still sending in a press release that had the women's names being uh, their husbands' names being used for women, the first and last name. So I had to actually call up the person who had sent the press release and actually ask for the first names because I thought, well, that, and I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that that was still being done. And the person on the other end of the phone, that's just how they did it. And she was of a generation ahead of me, and that's just how they did it. That's how they always referred to them in the programs at their organization, and she was kind of surprised that we wouldn't accept it that way, and we would like the women's first names, their given first names. So we actually ended up, I think, putting in the newspaper a little editorial comment that said, if you're sending, it's our policy to have women's names. It's the mid 2000s, and it's now our policy that we include women's first names with anything that appears about them in the newspaper. Um, and I was doing some research on this topic after I, saw the Past in Pictures in the paper last week, and noticed that the newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, in fact, actually had to change their policy because women wanted to, in many instances, were still sending their own names in as Mrs. John Smith. And so they had to change their policy. Um, and that's where it seems to have changed. But it took till like the 80s or 1990s, and as I was saying, it even bled into the early 2000s, where women's names women were being referred to by that. It got so as I was doing some research. Now this goes back to they believe Victorian times even earlier, where women actually, when they got married, took on their legally and otherwise took on their husband's identity. So they became Mrs. and their husband's name, and it wasn't just in society purposes. It was how you were referred to in the newspaper. So in the Easter Advertiser, up until probably the 1970s, they were referring to married women as Mrs. and their husband's name, even in our local newspaper. So this was a custom that was going on for a very long time. And it goes back to this, what they call law coverture, where the women, once they married their husband, took their husband's identity, so to speak, and were referred to by their husband's name. Now, this causes a ton of problems, in addition to the fact that women should have their own identity. And I found it was interesting when they were talking about we don't know the women's first names from this 1974 pictures, this Past in Pictures that was published last week, without some digging through the archives to try to find out. And that's what ends up happening. It's causing a huge problem, not only with the fact that women kind of lost their identity in many respects in the old newspapers and in the old documents, um, and there are some cases where actual legal documents have the husband's name and wife. So some deeds to properties don't even put the wife's name in. It just says and wife. So they could own something together, but the woman's name isn't included. It's just fascinating to me that that is still they're trying to correct some of these things, but that we still have holdovers from this period of time where women weren't identified. They were identified through the identity of their husband, not only on the society pages of the newspaper, but in legal documents as well. Um, so policies changed at newspapers, particularly and that kind of had to force some change because some people were still sending press releases in. Um, so the what causes problems with this, though, is, for instance, legal documents even that say "and wife." Which wife? Some men outlived their wives. The wife might have passed away. They could have divorced. Um, and had second and even third wives. And if you see them listed as "and wife," you don't know which one they're referring to unless you go back and do a lot of digging and make a timeline of the husband's marriages and figure out who he was married to at the time. Same with the Mrs. Jack Williams or the Mrs. John Smith in the newspaper. If John Smith had a second wife or even a third wife, um, that Mrs. John Smith is referring to three different women, or even more, depending on how many times he was married. If he was widowed and he remarried, a second Mrs. John Smith comes along, and you're reading that in the newspaper today, trying to figure out who that woman is. It makes it much more difficult to identify in the newspaper. And as you can see, today in the past in pictures, they had trouble figuring out the first names of these women because their first names were not included. So it really causes problems. Obituaries, even back in the day, the you'd have to dig down, and sometimes they didn't into the like fourth paragraph to figure out what her first name was, because the headline of the obituary would have Mrs. John Smith, and the first sentence would say Mrs. John Smith died, and then down in like the third or fourth paragraph they'd say, the former Mrs. Beatrice Pierce or whatever, and then you'd find out her first name. But that was way far down in the obituary, if they included her first name at all. So this old custom, which isn't as old as we would like to think, it kept going into the 70s and 80s, um, and into the 90s. It really causes problems trying to figure out some historical references. Um, Toward the 70s or 80s, it seems, just from what I can tell in the newspaper, although they were referring to women in many cases by their husband's first and last name, a lot of women referred to by their own last name. And so there was an overlap in time, so overlap in the custom and the style of the newspaper and other sources. So, like, you'll see some women referred to by their name and other women referred to by their married name. And this causes even more confusion because traditionally, if a woman um, it was widowed, she lost her husband, she may have dropped his name and gone to Mrs. Mary Smith. Um, so you could figure out whether a woman was married by whether it said Mrs. on it, or whether she was still married based on whether her first name was used or her husband's first name was used. But as the tradition was changing over a couple decades in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, it's very difficult to figure that out. Um, and sometimes men's names and women's names are very similar, or there's uh, uh, names that could apply to both men and women, and you don't know if that was her first name. It gets really confusing. So I'm glad we're done with that tradition. But when you see those names, it goes back to a very early custom of women taking on their husband's identity. And we carried it in unbelievably into the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s in some instances. Um, and we held on to this old custom, and the newspapers even did that. All the East Aurora advertisers from the 1970s, even in my lifetime, were referring to women by their husbands' names, and it's kind of crazy to think of that way. And what was very interesting is how quickly it seems that tradition got dropped, and I think it was just the newspapers and legal documents, and of course there are some that have not been dropped, and there's some parts of how we refer to women and are treated in legal documents and things that still need improvement. However, and the phone book, things like that. But I think it became a quick changeover when the newspaper started um, changing the policy to try to match sort of the way that the custom was falling out of favor. And so, and women not necessarily wanting to be referred to by their marital status. And that came around in the 70s more so, and the newspapers stopped referring to women by their husband's name. And I think that really quickly changed it, so that we have younger people today who don't know a world where women were referred to by their husband's names, which is kind of interesting. Some of these things were the women themselves holding on to that tradition. My grandmother being one of them. My grandmother's tradition, or my grandmother's generation, I have her old letters and things, and she had she would put the return address, and it was Mrs. Werner Galler for years. Then she became an ordained minister. She went to school to become an ordained minister, and she immediately changed to the Reverend Jessie Goller. So she used her own name after she became ordained. So that old tradition went away when she became an ordained minister. So she changed it on her own in the early 80s when she became an ordained minister, which I find interesting. So I can tell the progression. But she was Mrs. Werner Goller, her husband's name, until she became an ordained minister. So um, why did this tradition keep going on for so long, this custom keep going on until the 70s, 80s? No idea. And I think it took there was a lot of holding on to old traditions and not even thinking about it. It's just the way we've always done it, and women um, were just connecting themselves with their husbands' names until it was pointed out that it was it wasn't working very well for all the reasons that I just discussed, but also our change in attitude toward the identity of women. And it started, I think, a big part of it was how they were referred to in the newspaper. I think that was a big signal to people. If we're referring to women through their husbands' names in the newspaper, that's sort of a sign of how the society was working. And once that changed, and the newspapers changed it, which took the Washington Post was actually talking about they didn't even start really changing things until the 90s officially in their style book. Fascinating to me that it took that long. So there's a little history of that, and that was just from an idea and some thoughts that were spurred by a Past in Pictures that appeared in last week's East Aurora Advertiser of the East Aurora. It was a fashion show at the East Aurora Country Club that they were sharing with us. Again, thank you for joining me each week. I love doing this, chatting a little bit about some of the research that I'm doing, and or like this, some things that I've come across. Again, I'm Robert Goller. I am the town and village historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not connected officially with my position as town and village historian. And of course, if you have any ideas or comments, feel free to send them along. Either put them in the comments or send me a private message, as many of you do. And as always, these videos are also available on YouTube on my station, my channel, not station, my channel, Robert Lowell Goller, if you like watching them in that way. Again, thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one, and thank you for keeping history alive.